Today on TimesCast, witnesses say Syrian security forces killed at least 73 people during Friday protests. The U.S. sends armed Predator drones to Libya, and the op-ed columnist Roger Cohen compares the Balkan conflict to present-day Libya and Syria.
Syria witnessed demonstrations and protests in perhaps more than 20 towns and cities across the country. The breadth was remarkable, from Israel down in southwestern Syria, all the way to the coast in Benias. For the last 24 hours, the government has been mobilizing its security forces, particularly in Homs, Syria's third largest city, and in the capital, Damascus, obviously the capital being a source of prestige for the government. Protest organizers had seen Friday as crucial in trying to build momentum. They called it Great Friday. The images that made their way out of Syria, still one of the most closed countries in the Middle East, were striking. Tens of thousands of protesters in towns on the outskirts of Damascus and in cities across the country. But Syria has yet to achieve that Egypt or Tunisia-style momentum. It doesn't seem like a tipping point has been approached yet. And the government still enjoys a lot of support among certain sectors of the country. The security services and the military are firmly on the government's side. So is an upper middle class that's profited under this regime in past years, especially in Damascus, who fear the example of what they've seen in Iraq across the border. And they fear also what might follow the collapse of this government. That fear is one of the main sources of support that this government is able to draw on. The protests were witnessed in perhaps 20 towns and cities across Syria today, but in fact the aftermath might be even more compelling. In past weeks, the funerals for people killed in these protests have often attracted larger numbers of demonstrators. That may be the case again tomorrow, when certain towns and cities across Syria bury their dead from the demonstrations and the clashes that occurred today.
In Libya, the United States steps up its military role.
President Obama has authorized the use of armed Predator drones over Libya in a rather significant addition to the NATO arsenal, and a sign that the alliance is really struggling to sustain the mission several weeks after the Americans turned over command of the alliance. The Predators have been flying surveillance missions since the start of the mission, but arming them with Hellfire drones is the first time since April 4th that American warplanes will be striking and able to strike Libyan ground targets, especially troops. The Predator brings a very unusual skill to the battlefield. It can fly for very long amounts of time, loitering over a target. It has real-time video, it has infrared sensors, and it can watch very carefully to try to discriminate hostile targets from civilians. This is an important response to what Gaddafi's forces have done, because they are now traveling the battlefield in unmarked cars, civilian trucks, and SUVs just to spoof the NATO warplanes overhead, who are afraid to attack civilian vehicles for fear of hitting non-combatants. The possible targets for the Predator is a matter of great discussion here. The Obama administration is holding to a very strict and narrow definition of the United Nations Security Council resolution, and so they only want the Predators to be used to defend civilians at risk. There have been some suggestions, though, that because the Predator has been so effective in tracking down al-Qaeda leaders in Pakistan and elsewhere, that it could be used to actually go after Gaddafi or other members of his leadership. If that's the mission, it's not one the government's talking about right now, and it raises questions of whether there's been a presidential finding to actually go after Gaddafi and the leadership.
There are interesting parallels, I think, between Yugoslavia, which was held together under Tito, strongman like Gaddafi, and what's going on in Libya and Syria. What's happened is, as in Yugoslavia, when the lid came off with the fall of communism, Yugoslavia basically split between its constituent peoples, between Serbs, Croats, Bosnians, and others. In a similar way, in Libya, you're seeing old tribal divisions between the area around Tripoli and the tribes around there that are loyal to Gaddafi, and the Benghazi area, which is where the king whom Gaddafi ousted came from. And Gaddafi's always been, even before all this happened, very suspicious of Benghazi, never provided any funds to it, and that's part of the resentment there. In Syria, the ruling Assad family, ruling now for 40 years, represent a minority group, the Alawites. And some of the anger is being fueled by this sense, why should this minority lord it over Sunnis and others who constitute the majorities? It's a very revolutionary idea in these societies that are not cohesive in the way that Tunisia and Egypt are, to get the idea accepted that one group, one tribe, doesn't have to trample and repress another